Well, I welcome the panelists and speakers for the next session. While we do so, I'll just introduce the topic, interpretation at scale. And what you'll see here with the theme of these topics is really, the focus here is not just newborn sequencing, obviously at the theoretical level, but it really is the implementation of that, starting to roll it out at population levels and getting it into the clinics and into the hands of clinicians. And so these themes really follow that, the technologies behind that, interpretation, the ecosystem, so building the ecosystem, and to the first question on privacy and the ethics behind this and sharing, and then finally treatment of rare diseases. So with that, I will pass it on to the panelists for interpretation, Dr. Robert Green, who will be moderating, and who will kick it off for us will be Genomenon Mark Kyle.
Thank you, Nick. I'll be greeting you on behalf of the conference later tonight for sure, but for now, I'll just help moderate, hopefully as skillfully as Rich did just then, and starting off with Mark.
Thank you so much, Robert. Nicholas, I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversations and the content already. I'm really looking forward to more. And as I was listening to the first panel discussion, my thought turned to what we're going to do with all this information. What are we going to do with this data? And so this is a perfect time for me to talk about what we're doing at Genomenon. But first, I'll introduce myself, my background. I'm a molecular genetic pathologist by training and a part-time bioinformatician by necessity. I am the chief science officer and founder of Genomenon, and I'm going to be speaking to variant interpretation at scale for newborn sequencing. So I think this is a shared understanding across all of the members of the audience here that biochemical newborn screening is a great triumph of public health policy. But into this background, we're talking about introducing genome sequencing, which promises to not only broaden the number of diseases that can be screened and identify more patients, including those who are pre-symptomatic, for improved healthcare outcomes, but also to homogenize the testing across multiple labs in multiple countries. And so that's an important issue that was already brought up in some of the questioning. But to do this, there are many challenges that remain. And those challenges can span the gamut from technical to ethical and everything in between. And one of those challenges, the data component, particularly the interpretation component, is what Genomenon is really focused on. And we're engaged with a number of partners, many of whom are here, the Beginnings Program and the CDC and others. And we're at the stage now where we're collecting and assessing this data in these pilot programs to truly have an evidence predicate for the successful outcome of newborn sequencing. And those different bullets that I've listed there are a couple of the aspects that we need to turn our attention to when assessing the outcomes of this endeavor. Those include, and have already been mentioned, some of them: sensitivity of the data, making sure we're not missing patients; specificity of the data, making sure that we're not challenging the healthcare system and putting undue stress and emotional burden on patients of falsely identified individuals through the screening; assessing the impact overall to the healthcare system; and critically, making sure that we're mindful of the cost and the time it's going to take to develop these assays and to run them. So I hesitate to be so bold as to say the most important challenge, but one of the most important challenges is in variant interpretation. It's certainly the one that I care most deeply about. And current workflow in sequencing and interpreting the variants for sick individuals is not fit to purpose for screening. There's fundamental differences in the patient population and the workflow requirements. That current system of interpreting variants for sick individuals involves a real-time, one-at-a-time variant interpretation where you have the benefit of knowing what the clinical circumstances are for that patient, that individual. So that's not feasible for newborn sequencing for a variety of reasons, not least of which we're talking about an unselected, unknown, presumed healthy population. And so that real-time, one-at-a-time variant interpretation, which is otherwise very laborious and very idiosyncratic, will not apply to newborn sequencing if we're to meet our cost and time requirements for these programs. The current infrastructure that I'm talking about for interpreting variants for sick individuals, we have too few people to do this work. I've talked to a number of you before the conference here who are on the front lines, and there's an acute realization that there's not enough people to do this work. They don't have enough time, and there's too little coordination across labs. And so those are some challenges that we need to rise to make newborn sequencing a reality. So how do we make that a reality? If the old way of interpreting variants is insufficient, I feel strongly that we need a completely different approach. And that completely different approach is to aggregate and pre-curate all of the evidence associated with these variants into a database of actionable variants that has that evidence presented to those who are tasked with interpreting that meaning in the context of screening. Again, a very different context than the typical context where you have a diseased individual who you're trying to diagnose. And the end deliverable of that database of actionable variants should function as a simple lookup table. And where that lookup table can be intercalated into current workflows for sequencing, including being put in the back of the bioinformatics for one of these sequencers that we heard about in the last panel. So I'd like to paint a picture. This is the future that I'm imagining in my own mind and that Genomenon is taking great strides to realize is a fully curated human genome. And what that means is every disease and every gene and every variant in any one of those disease-causing genes, with every reference that cites that variant and all of the necessary database information for population frequency and predictive pathogenicity, all of that information pre-interpreted in the context of a sequencing initiative according to clinically standard guidelines with all of that evidence annotated and displayed. So that's the vision that I have for this database, which will upend the current model of real-time variant interpretation. So we're doing that at Genomenon. We've already amassed all of this data through our computational technology, and we've built out an internal capability to curate this data at breakneck speed. And we're starting with the curation of the hundreds of genes associated with the Beginnings program to be delivered at the end of this quarter. So the details I don't want to belabor here. I'm happy to go through them if anybody wants to have a conversation afterwards. But we have a unique combination of curation and computation to ensure maximal specificity and maximal sensitivity of the data. And it comes out of our AI and our expert team of variant analysts. And I do believe this is the penultimate slide here. I want to end by saying that there's great power in aggregation and assimilation of these multiple different data sets. One such different data set outside of the published studies and the evidence in the medical and clinical literature is data from the real world, data that's encountered in clinical casework in those different clinics across the globe as they're submitted to ClinVar. So I've referred to that as real world data. And if you look at the Venn diagram here, there's crescents of difference. There's healthy overlap in the middle of variants that have been seen in the clinic and reported in literature, but there's crescents of difference on the outside where there are variants that are disease causing that are only found in the literature. And there's variants that are only found in those case analyses from real-time variant interpretation. And there's a power in merging those data. There's also a power in using evidence to be sure that we disambiguate that data. We appreciate what diseases those variants were seen in the context of. We reconcile the information that was present or not present in the submissions to those real-world databases, and we use the evidence to adjudicate the true meaningfulness of each of those variants. And so to round out my story and where I see the future, I couldn't help but think 5-10 years into the future where we're all invested in the present moment and how we're going to make this a reality. I'm seeing a near future in 5 or 10 years when we have amassed all of this evidence and all of this sequencing data. The more of that being published and captured by Genomenon, the more of those one-off variants being submitted to ClinVar, this virtuous continual circle of refining our process and the way that we adjudicate and use this information. I see a bright future for newborn sequencing where more and more patients' lives will be positively impacted. So with that, I'll be seated on the panel and happy to take any questions there or afterwards. Thank you so much.
Jeanette McCarthy from Fabric for sort of the two pre-planned remarks, and then we'll have conversation.
Great, thanks, Robert, and thank you for allowing Fabric to be here to present today at this inaugural newborn sequencing conference. I am Jeanette McCarthy. I am VP of Precision Medicine at Fabric Genomics, and for those of you who don't know Fabric, we are a bioinformatics company located in Oakland, California, and we help laboratories to launch and scale next-gen sequence-based genetic tests. And we do this with a combination of our software, AI, and clinical services. Our customers include hospital systems, for example, Providence, Intermountain, Rady's Children's Hospital, Lurie, Cincinnati Children's, as well as large reference labs like LabCorp and Quest, and small labs as well. We're proud to be part of the Beginnings program with Stephen Kingsmore's group, and also proud to announce a collaboration that we formed with the Broad Institute recently to be their clinical interpretation partner. So Fabric offers software that really picks up where the sequencer leaves off. We take a VCF file or a FASTQ file and run it through secondary analysis, tertiary analysis, all the way through clinical reporting. So you can upload your file and get a physician-ready report out of that. But really the secret sauce in our software is our AI. And this AI was developed to address some of the analytical challenges and interpretation bottlenecks that are really inherent to next-gen sequence-based testing. So what are the analytical challenges for expanded newborn sequencing? So first of all, it's presumed that many of the panels that will be offered for newborn sequencing will be drawn off of whole exome or whole genome as a backbone. So doing these in silico panels, which allows the users to expand as needed in the future. And I've heard anywhere from 150 to 600 genes to start with, which means that per patient, you will need to interpret hundreds of single nucleotide variants and potentially dozens of copy number and other structural variants. And so there's a large number of variants that need interpretation, and it's really about balancing the accuracy and efficiency. How do we develop the most accurate test, maximizing sensitivity and specificity, while being able to do this with as little work as possible to be able to scale it? So the goal of newborn sequencing will be to identify pathogenic and maybe likely pathogenic variants in newborns at scale. And depending on how thorough you want to be with your analysis, it's going to impact the efficiency or the accuracy. So take, for example, on the left part of the graph there in green, if we develop a test that only looks at known pathogenic and likely pathogenic variants, so we only look for those and report out on those, what will happen is you will have an efficient test, but perhaps not so accurate. Those variants are going to be the most common ones in the population. You'll find those in ClinVar, in LSDBs, in HGMD, and Mastermind will have curated all of those. And Genomenon will have curated and put them in their Mastermind database for everybody to use. But if you just stop there, what you're missing is this long tail of novel or not previously curated variants. And I don't know how long that tail is. And if anybody does know, I'd like to know how long that tail is and what % of newborns who have one of these diseases are actually represented in that group. I don't think anybody knows the answer, but I think that everyone agrees, at least at this point, that we will need to address this long tail. And if you look at the studies that have evaluated the sensitivity of newborn sequencing using next-gen sequencing to date, you'll see in these 4 studies represented here that, first of all of them have very similar sensitivity in the high 80s. And all of them, of course, look for known pathogenic, likely pathogenic variants. And their source for that is primarily ClinVar, although the latest study by Stephen Kingsmore's group also incorporated a large number of variants curated by Genomenon in their mastermind database. All of these studies also address that long tail, but they did it in slightly different ways. The first 3 studies all took a filtering approach. They basically looked at all of those variants and said, show me the rare variants that are loss of function that are predicted to be damaging. The Kingsmore study, on the other hand, incorporated Fabric's GEM AI, and that's what I wanted to talk about for the next few slides. So Fabric developed an AI algorithm called GEM. Fabric has a long history of developing algorithms for finding or ranking causal variants, and this work was all developed for the purpose of indication-based testing. So diagnostic testing, we apply this, for example, to children in the neonatal intensive care unit or for solving diagnostic odysseys. So this algorithm is super powerful for identifying causal variants in people who have symptomatic disease. GEM takes into account variant deleteriousness. It takes into account HPO terms from the patient. We look at data from OMIM, from ClinVar. We have ways of filtering out well-known sequencing artifacts, taking into account potential consanguinity, ancestry, sex, and basically puts all of this together in a gene prioritization algorithm and goes through the whole genome or whole exome and prioritizes those variants. So you can read more about this technology in our publication shown here if you'd like. But we have benchmarked GEM's performance for indication-based testing in a number of cohorts. The data shown here come from the paper that I just mentioned. GEM has shown overall sensitivity for detecting causal single nucleotide variants in small indels of about 98%. If you look at the candidates that GEM provides per patient, most of the causal variants rank as number 1. The average number of candidate variants that GEM ranks per case is fewer than 10. And GEM, importantly, also has sensitivity for detecting causal copy number and other structural variants with a sensitivity of about 95%. Shown on the right is a typical case where you have a GEM output that shows, in this case, 5 candidate genes. You can click on those, open up the gene drawers, get more information, and take these all the way through reporting in our software platform. So GEM was really designed for indication-based testing, but earlier this year, we started thinking about whether we could use this same algorithm to identify causal variants in the absence of phenotype. And so we did a quick proof of concept study where we used the top of the HBO tree, which is a term phenotypic abnormality, and just put that into a case, uploaded a genome, used that as the term for HPO and asked if we could find the causal variant. So we did this proof of concept in a small cohort of about 12 cases. These are kids from the NICU who had known causal variants, either in a single gene or copy number variants, shown here. Some of these were variants that were known in ClinVar, others were not. And in the light blue, you see how the GEM algorithm performed in its standard mode using HPO terms from the patient. All of them ranked highly. And on the right, though, we use just this generic HPO term. And much to our surprise, GEM performed very well, even without HPO terms. It found all of the same variants except for one. It missed one, and the rankings were not that much further off than they were for using the indication-based HPO terms. So we were really encouraged by this, and over the last several months, we've done some more development work. The development work that we've done has been meant to address some of the shortcomings that we saw so far. One of them being that we're talking about using in silico panels for the newborn sequencing where you only want to see results from your set of genes. And yet GEM was an algorithm that was built on a whole genome, whole exome. So basically what we were able to do is develop a very simple filter so you can run GEM on the entire genome exome, take that information into account, and yet present only the results for the genes you're interested in. We also have been able to boost the rank of all of the causal variants to number 1. We have found in benchmarking now in over 100 positive and over 300 negative cases that GEM has a sensitivity of about 93%. And importantly, and shown on the graph on the right, is instead of having about 10 candidates per case, we've now been able to shrink that and reduce it to fewer than one. So we're really excited about our technology as a means of having a sensitive and efficient tool for identifying and interpreting variants for newborn sequencing. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much. You guys did a great introduction to yourself and your companies. Paul, could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you're doing at GeneDx?
Hey, good afternoon. My name is Paul Krushka. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at GeneDx Semaphore. I'm also a practicing clinical geneticist in Washington, D.C. So I'm a physician by training. And, this is really cool. We're, GeneDx Semaphore traditionally has been a diagnostic laboratory, commercial laboratory, diagnosing rare diseases. We've done over 400,000 clinical exomes. So these are mainly kids who are sick, and we've got an incredible database. But now I think it's time to move on past that into the screening, the screening space. And so it's really exciting that we're dipping our toes into this. And we've been scaling for years. We knew this day was coming, so we've really been building our program to scale to do millions of genomes. And so, it's really cool. And we're proud partners with Dr. Chung and the Guardian Project, which you'll hear plenty about later. Thanks.
Fantastic, great. And Lil, could you introduce yourself? You wrote, for the audience who doesn't know, you wrote one of the most beautiful articles summarizing where we were that got published in JAMA a bit back, and now you're pursuing one of the groups in Australia pursuing things. Maybe introduce yourself, and then together we'll quiz some of these folks about where they're going as an industry.
Thanks, Robert. So my name's Lil Downey. I've come from Melbourne, Australia. I'm a clinical geneticist. And as Robert mentioned, we're really excited to be looking at what's been happening in this field and starting a program early next year, which I'll share with you tomorrow. But it's great to hear about how the industry partners are evolving to change our approach from what we're all used to, which is that diagnostic setting, and being able to scale things up and automate and change our view for looking at population screening.
Fantastic. So if you guys will start to consider your questions and wave over people with the microphone, we'll get those queued up, and also folks online. But we'll start, I think, by let me ask you a question about Genomenon. When I hear what you're doing, it sounds really remarkable. But I also imagine that this is a resource that the world should have available to it. Maybe this should be something that's really open to everyone, every lab in the world. Whereas certain labs have built up their own proprietary approaches to this. I don't know if GeneDx Semaphore has, but certainly when you think about the big labs, they're doing some version of this themselves. How does this square with a public resource that we all need versus resources that are private, and how do you think about that?
It's a great question. I hope I can be heard. I think I neglected to mention that our mission at Genomenon is to save and improve lives by making genomic information actionable. And it can't be actionable if it's not available. And so we have a couple of ways to make that information available, the first of which is that we offer the mastermind solution for anybody to use for free. And there's value in getting that data out there to ensure that the maximal number of patients can be diagnosed, particularly for some of these rare and deadly diseases. And so that's one of the ways that we make our information available. Other ways are in allying with some of these otherwise siloed data resources. Taking in some of that data that I mentioned comes only from the casework that's pre-publication. And then a third way is working with groups like ClinVar, where there is data available, and integrating their data into our resource to consolidate that information. And there's efforts afoot to talk about getting our data cross-platform as well.
Thanks. And Paul, as you hear that, hear that discussion, do you think of them as allies, competitors, complementary?
Well, first of all, Mark went to the University of Michigan, where I went, so I would never consider him a adversary or whatever you say, competitor. But I think Mark brings up a good point, because the data is really where it's at. It can mean really the difference between a VUS, variant of unknown significant, and a likely pathogenic variant, and that can change someone's life, whether you get one of those variants. So we do contribute we're one of the big contributors to ClinVar. Is that enough? No. I think there's a lot more that can be done, with data, and yeah, data sharing, I think, is going to be the name of the game as millions of people get their genome sequenced. Maybe not in my career, but the next generation for sure. And also, publications is still important too. I think we all should be publishing as many papers as we can, case reports. And we were collaborators with a lot of different groups. We use GeneMatcher. I have a whole team that we just answer, hundreds of GeneMatcher queries a day. And we give you, or we actually connect you with the provider who sent that in. And we want you to publish, because I think that's important as well.
Right now, the profession of curation scientist is one of the hottest sort of jobs you can take. Are you guys going to put curation scientists and geneticists, once you start off, are you going to put curation scientists out of business? Are you going to make it so that we don't quite need them anymore? How's that going to work?
No, there will be plenty of jobs available still. And
We're hiring.
Everybody is hiring. But I feel like, slogging through a bunch of variants and just using your brain to do it is pretty inefficient. And that's where I really feel like AI is where it's at. And once you begin to trust some of the algorithms that you're using, that they'll find pathogenic variants, that if it doesn't find anything, there's nothing there. Once you begin to trust that, you can really start to reduce your manual interpretation and your need for variant scientists, and allow them to spend time focused on the really important things.
Lil, as you hear this and you think about the projects that you're getting going in Australia and others are getting going, any red flags, any enthusiasms you want to highlight as you hear all this?
Yeah, I think there's a big bridge to be gapped between the value of that manual curation. So we all have had the case in a diagnostic setting where the human power is they can search the literature and see the case that was published yesterday. And I think a real challenge is going to be to get that automation, machine learning and artificial intelligence up to speed so that we don't miss out on those opportunities. And also, I think one of the other things that stands out to me is that equity is going to be really important in a population screening program. And we want to be able to scale things so that all populations can access the technology. And we want the technology to be able to learn from the inputs that it's had and get better understanding of natural history and allele frequencies in those populations we haven't yet been able to offer sequencing to.
Any reactions to the diversity question? We all know that databases we're pulling from are disproportionately European ancestries. And we all know that there's a huge challenge in correcting that. Any clever computational ways to help with that along the way?
Well, I'll have 2 points to raise, not a solution by any means, but one thing is to reemphasize that this is iterative and the data is going to be continually fed back into the system. So as we're thinking about screening from a broad platform, there's a great deal of rich data that we need to capture back into the system. And in particular, machine learning and AI is greedy for data. And so there are computational techniques that will allow us to make inferences about some of those ethnic differences. But a fundamental tenet, I think, especially in clinical medicine, is that you need an evidence predicate. And having that evidence predicate and displaying that evidence predicate is, I think, the way that we're going to linearly increment through this process.
Can you just define what's an evidence predicate?
Our primary evidence predicate at Genomenon is the published literature, the functional studies, the clinical cases, the repetition of that data. Those are the sorts of things that you need to see. But when we're talking about de novo variants, and I'm sure that some of the work that Gem is doing at Fabric requires pattern recognition. A very facile example would be not the same variant, but at the same residue, or in the same domain, or with a similar consequence. And there's that feed forward. The more data you get, the better able you are to recognize those patterns with those evidence predicates, even if you're talking about a de novo variant. So that's the sort of thing that I'm referring to. Again, I don't have a solution for it, but that's what we need in this positive feedback loop.
Along these lines of data, in commercial laboratories, there's an interesting phenomena in that, at least at GeneDx Semaphore, we only get what you send us. And a lot of times, that's only what insurance companies pay for, just as a broad-based rule. So we've gotten tons of exomes and, tens of thousands of exomes, but the genome data is lagging. And, I think, I'm excited to see more genome data, because you really need that. You need to know what's in that intronic space and start piling that or collecting that. And we can't make a zebrafish or a mouse for every intronic or every variant in the human genome. And we do rely on data for this. And so I think, one of the things that we're seeing that's really exciting is rapid sequencing in the NICU. And much of the medical literature, thankfully, was done with whole genomes. So the payers are paying for whole genomes. So we're seeing a lot of that data. And I'm excited with newborn screening, where, it looks like most people are going to go with the whole genome backbone, to see some more of this data fill our coffers.
Lil, what would you like to ask the panel? Or while you're thinking about that, is there any other questions popping up? Yeah, up there, please, go ahead.
Hi, sorry, Joanne Burkett. I'm a geneticist with Pfizer, and I can really appreciate the value it brings to the scalability of this to bring artificial intelligence and machine learning. But to what extent do you think that those rules, those machine learning rules, need to be gene specific? And is there anything you're doing to address that?
I can start by going into a little bit more depth in the slide that I said had a lot of detail behind it, is to say that our AI capability is sensitivity first. So cast as wide a net as you can to be sure that you're not missing anything when you're surveying the literature for these genes and variants and phenotypes, et cetera. And then to present that evidence to the end user or the internal curator in the case of Genomenon, so that that can be adjudicated for specificity. So sensitivity first, and then specificity second. And then your question was specifically, how does that pertain to gene-specific or disease-specific curation? It goes to the larger comment I made about the need to curate this data in a screening-specific context. It goes deeper than that at the gene-specific level, and there's modifications to the clinical framework that are disease-specific. There's penetrance issues with different genes, et cetera, and that we leave in the hands of the human experts who are curating this data at scale. They're sort of cyborgs with the AI powering their workflow, but every one of the assertions that you make in the curation is predicated on expert human review.
So I think I understand where the question is coming from when you think about all of the iterations around the ACMG classification guidelines and all of the work that's gone into figuring out all of the nuances for each specific gene. And it does get nuanced, and you can get totally lost in the weeds on every single gene, which I feel like the approach that we're taking with GEM, where you're looking on a genome-wide level, you're looking across the entire genome, there is a ton of information available in a given individual across all of these genes. And at some point, all of those individual nuances that we're worried about for ACMG criteria kind of go to the wayside because you're dealing with the whole genome and learning so much about these variants relative to the other variants in the genome. So,
Any other questions up there? We've got an online question from Bernadette.
Yeah, this is a question from someone viewing on the live stream. It's about ClinGen, not ClinVar. The questioner notes that ClinGen is a public, community-driven curation effort, and its variant interpretation process has been FDA approved. How do the curation activities presented today by commercial entities align with and contribute to ClinGen?
I'd say at this early stage that we've had conversations with those folks, and we're aware of those disease-specific guidelines that I spoke to earlier. We follow the same process with the same evidence. We have more of it because of our computational capability, and we're able to produce this data much faster. And in pursuit of getting this data to be maximally util and maximally available, we welcome the opportunity to work with those groups. From a commercial perspective to a public perspective. I mean, that's a very serious gap to bridge. So I don't want to trivialize that, but there's a willingness on our part to work with those groups.
I would just like to say that ClinGen's a really cool program. I've worked on the craniosynostosis work group, and it's incredibly valuable. And the process is valuable too, the way you rank genes, and I think it has some applicability to newborn screening for sure. I know there are groups that have used that criteria to come up or evaluate genes. One thing I will say though, it's very manually intensive, and there's a lot of genes out there, and so that would be the one drawback. Is it's a slow process, and it's far from being complete.
Lil, these are U.S. companies, and I'm curious from your perspective, as you guys develop your programs, are there competing interests, procedures, teams, even companies that you would find yourself favoring? Do you feel like this is a real international world now, and you know anybody who's effective you can use? How does that work when you're coming all the way from Australia?
Yeah, it's a good question. The private sector of testing and industry is definitely much smaller in Australia, and we're lucky that we live in such an internationalised market, so we often use laboratories from around the world. I think one thing that's been raised in the Australian market is whether to address some of these issues of interpretation and manpower, whether we should just be doing something like variant detection when we're looking at a screening program, and we're trying to start quite conservatively. So I know there's some focus on that in Australia, and whether that will be realised or whether we will go with a more general approach and using the machine and manual interpretation is still a question to be answered. But I'd be interested if anyone has thought about using that as a process, just variant detection, obviously missing that tail end of cases.
I can just echo what you said, is to say that there's a tuning, right? There's a conservative approach, a more liberal approach, a more general approach. In this, Genomenon's approach is to be the data evidence supplier and to let the end user make those determinations. We're working with multiple different groups. Some are on one end of the spectrum, some are on the other. And again, a major mantra of mine personally and the companies more generally is evidence should lead. And where you draw the line in your approach in the disease-specific context is really what we're waiting to get the data for. As I said, evidence-based newborn sequencing is what I really am looking forward to in the next 5 years.
I've got a question. Oh, there's a question up there. Please grab the mic, Alessandra.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you. I'm Alessandra Ferlini from Italy, from the Screen for Care. So I'm fascinated by all AE-based genomic interpretation. So fantastic opportunities for the future. I have Two questions. The first is very simple: is are you going also to evaluate synonymous changes in your developed algorithm? Okay, because synonymous changes are our main huge problem for. I'm a medical geneticist for the data output interpretation. Okay. Second point, because we are talking about a diagnostic grade in newborn screening that we are going to offer, so I'm pay a lot of attention to diagnostics because I see patients, I do diagnostics. So just let's get an example, right? We have a panel with 400 genes, and we may have an output with, let's say, 200 novel variants to be defined in terms of meaning. If we be lucky, we can apply these new algorithms and we can define possibly 50% of these variants. But because we have asymptomatic infants, are we going on? Because I think we need to follow up all of them, both those that when we have some taste of or demonstration of possibly pathogenic variants, but all the others, because we cannot left anyone behind. So we have to have in place a clinical follow-up always. And then that's a provocative question for you, just to have your opinion about that, and then the synonymous as well. Thank you so much.
And that's a very multi-layered question. And as you guys jump in on that, but she mentioned synonymous variants. I'm also curious about missense variants.
Sure.
And this essentially the hierarchy of variants and how confident the group is, and how confident we are that this is a reasonable approach.
So I'll just jump in with respect to our GEM algorithm. You notice the slide that I presented that showed the results of the other studies that were done and how many labs took a filtering approach to identify potentially pathogenic variants. Our algorithm doesn't do that at all. It does consider every single variant in the genome and uses a lot of evidence about the potential deleteriousness that can help rank even nonsense or missense variants as well as synonymous variants highly if it seems to be damaging.
Just picking up on where you left off with the hierarchy, the two questions are actually merged in pretest probability. You hit the nail on the head when you talk about this being a healthy population. If you have a synonymous variant, there's a low pretest probability that will have any damaging effect. If instead you're looking at a sick individual where there's a synonymous variant in a disease-causing gene that matches those symptoms, the pretest probability goes up. And from my perspective, the way that you deal with those synonymous variants is, what is the functional evidence that damages splicing, say? What is the clinical circumstance where you see segregation with disease? And if those two things aren't true, there's no such evidence in the context of screening of a otherwise healthy population. I feel like when we're trying to balance the sensitivity specificity profile, that's where you would want to be more conservative and not rely on an algorithmic approach with an absence of evidence. It's different if you're talking about a different population. So context really matters, but you said it quite rightly. There's synonymous variants, there's missense variants, then there's nonsense and frameshift, and they're on a hierarchy. And there's a higher likelihood in a disease-causing variant that operates by loss of function if you have a nonsense mutation toward the 5' end of the gene. So those are some of the considerations that we have to bring to bear. And I can't remember the questioner's name, but those are very disease and context specific.
Paul, there's a question, but just before that, kind of building on this for a second, when we have done the MedSeq project and then the BabySeq project, which we'll talk about tomorrow, and even in the sort of under the radar clinics that we've had, our preventive genomics clinic, we get people who, although the indication is apparently healthy individuals, we get people who are enriched for family history, or what I like to call quasi-indication based. They do not have a full phenotype, but they may be seeking us out or maybe seeking the research project out because they sense or believe that something might be there. So if we imagine a world in which there's a lot of sequencing and we do variant interpretation one way for indication-based, which at the very least includes VUSs, and we do variant interpretation and screening in another way for apparently healthy individuals, I'd like to ask each of you, how do you think about that quasi-indication-based group? Will we just miss them? Will they have to develop symptoms in order to then flip into an indication-based work stream? Is there some second tier of variants that we kind of hold in reserve? Do we identify VUS pluses and sprinkle them around? I'd like to ask everybody on the panel how you might think, because I've really been worried about this question. So let's start with you, Mark, and work our way all the way over to Lil.
Sure. I've called VUS pluses VUS with benefits and more colloquial circumstances. But that's exactly right. Many of those variants are waiting for evidence, functional studies to be run, additional cases to be seen. And so in talking to Dr. Bick this morning, what are we going to do with those variants that are either de novo, where we have a healthy or screened individual? Now you're talking about a quasi-healthy, unhealthy. There's some reason to believe that there's an increased risk. That's where follow-up is necessary, and re-infusion of the data that we get from that follow-up will be really critical, because as I said, I'm not looking at this from a year or two from now. I'm looking at it from 5 or 10 years, which will come very briskly here. And I don't want to make a mistake as a field of not capturing and using that data.
Jeanette, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, my mind goes to Matchmaker Exchange and what a great tool that is for bringing together all these data sources. But I really feel like we need to blow that out and just enhance that capability of connecting patients, because that's really where we're going to start being able to solve those.
I think these are two different things, screening versus diagnosis. And for screening, it's presumably healthy infants. So the idea is you're screening, you're looking for, we mentioned the Wilson Younger criteria, you're looking for genes that have actionability. It's a finite set of genes. Now, if that infant, which often happens in rare disease, presents maybe at a year of life, 2 years of life, 3 years of life, well, then you have the genome and you can go back and then look at it and hopefully have the parents as well. I want to put a plug in for Trios, much higher diagnostic rate. So I think there are two different things, and there are two different math problems too. If you think about healthy infants, the prevalence of rare disease is going to be lower. So the positive predictive value is going to be much lower because it rides on specificity. Whereas, the usual state of care at our commercial laboratories, we're getting very, very sick kids. And the prevalence of a genetic condition is extremely high. And so the positive predictive value is much, much higher. So I just think they're two different things. But if you have the DNA, you have the sequence, you can go back, right? You can go back and look if that kid develops seizures or developmental differences.
Yep. But I'm sort of thinking about this netherworld between indication-based and screening. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we can't forget the families that we're trying to provide a benefit for, and the healthy baby in the hospital that the parents are not expecting any health problems for is a very different kettle of fish to the baby that's brought to the doctor's office with a family history or with any concerns. And in that paper that you mentioned, Robert, that that our group wrote last year, parents valued the healthy population. Parents valued the accuracy of the test far more than any other factor, like the treatableness of the condition. And so I think, echoing what the others said, I think we need to be really cautious, and we're all quite comfortable in leaving VUSs out of this screening context. And the real value of genomic newborn screening is that we do have the data there, and that will certainly be the approach that our group is taking, that if a family history or a symptom develops and that baby is brought to the doctor's office, that's when that data can be re-looked at and interpreted in a different way.
I want to go to our questioner up here, but we have about 5 minutes left. And after we address this question, I'd like to get the panel's thoughts on the question of sensitivity versus specificity, and in the context of the narrative of determinism that society as a whole has for genetics. I think a false narrative of determinism. And so if we offer through research, commercial entities, or anything else, if we offer whole genome sequencing to screen your baby, it's going to be inevitable. It's already inevitable with 23andMe. It's going to be inevitable that some families think this is an encyclopedic survey of anything and everything that could go wrong in the health of their baby, both genetic and otherwise. And so I want to end up this session. It's not really around variant interpretation, but there is a degree to which the focus on, let's say, specificity will necessarily exaggerate the number of things that we miss. In other words, lower our sensitivity. So let me ask you to think on that for a second while we take our Amazon questioner up there, and we'll come back to that.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Green, and hi everyone. Again, your friendly neighborhood Amazon genomicist here. I'm very vocal, sorry. And so excellent discussion panel. And Dr. Green, I really want the panel to address your question, so I'll turn my question into a comment. There are close to 200 population sequencing initiatives being launched worldwide, and I'm hoping that more and more of these are focusing on newborn. I mean, it's a personal passion of mine to see genomics being applied at the birth and then traveling the lifetime of the person. I really want to see, because the true interpretation at scale starts to happen when these initiatives start to come together in a federated global data mesh of genotypes and phenotypes. I really want to see the panel talk about, maybe not today, maybe in discussions, how we keep enriching the phenotype as these people, these individuals go through their lifetimes. They develop medical histories. How do we keep going back? Like the genome at some level becomes static, but the phenotype continuously keeps getting enriched. And now you're thinking about it at a global scale. So would love to see the panel talk about their technologies, how to keep this relevant long-term.
Yeah, that is such an important issue. And I don't want to give it short shrift, because in some ways it's a fundamental thread through the conference today. It's one of the raison d'etres for holding the conference in the first place, is that we, first 7 or 8 groups that are assembling for this conference, and all of you, can start to talk together about how we can actually federate, to share techniques for phenotype collection, ongoing engagement, and outcomes harmonization. So let me defer a little bit that discussion, which I think will thread through the whole conference. And maybe starting, Lil, on your end, because we were always starting with Mark over here. Let's finish up our conversation here for today by reflecting a little bit on what we will miss and how we deal with missingness when we imagine a screening program, both from a variant interpretation point of view and just from a human point of view.
Thanks, Robert. I think the real key to answering that question is in our approach to education. So how we're going to educate the public about what this test is and what it means. And in doing that, try and give them realistic expectations that it is a screening test. And I think that word is so important. This is a screen, it's not comprehensive, it's not diagnostic. And I don't have answers to how we educate the public on that, but I think that's really going to be the key to answering that question.
And I see nods and smiles from some of our newborn screening ecosystem experts in the audience, because they've had this for 50 years. And I think, if I'm interpreting their facial expressions correctly, I'm guessing, feel free to grab a mic and correct me, but I'm guessing that they're saying, good luck, fellas. We've had newborn screening for 50 years. It's a much simpler value proposition, and the public still doesn't. Did I interpret you correctly? Big nods there. Okay. But let's keep going, Paul.
Well, I think, we have had newborn screening for 50 years since Robert Guthrie. But this is really the first quantum leap if this is successful. We had tandem mass in the early 90s, and now this is the first time we're going to go from 30 to 40 conditions to almost an unlimited ceiling. And I think that's why, we should congratulate the principal investigators here for doing this type of research, because we need to answer those questions. How are we going to counsel the patients, the families, the parents? How are we going to educate them? What did we do right? What did we do wrong? And if we don't start somewhere, which I think we are with this conference, we're not going to know those answers.
Well, I'm certainly in agreement with that. I think one of the interesting reasons we're having these 4 little mini discussions in today's afternoon event before the conference officially launches tonight is because no one can imagine doing this without collaborating with private industry in all its various forms, labs, AI engines, and so forth. But private industry in the capitalist system will promote its positive value. It will simplify messages. It will tell people, hey, look at the greatest, latest thing that we have to sell you, as it should. And yet this will simplify and optimize the messaging, which we've just said is so important to moderate in order to mediate expectations. So, you guys are all in industry, and I know your hearts are in the right place, but Jeanette, as we talk about this theme, as we end up this session, what are your thoughts on that?
So I want to go back to your original question, because that one, for me, it's a great question. And it's something that I've thought about a lot, because when we were validating the GEM algorithm in NICU cases, right? Just seeing, could we use this algorithm without HPO terms? Ran it through and said, oh yeah, it performs well. And then I realized, oh wait, if we were going to do this for newborn sequencing, we would have to limit it to these. And I think we chose 500 genes. And when I did that, all of a sudden, there were only a few cases remaining, because it was about 2/3 of the cases would not have been on that panel. And it really got me thinking about the public health message. And how do you go and tell somebody, I'm doing newborn screening, and then I found nothing, and yet your kid ends up in the NICU? And I think it would be really informative to try and understand what proportion of kids who do end up in that situation in the neonatal intensive care unit, actually, what proportion would have been caught with this expanded newborn screening versus not, because that'll give us a good benchmark.
Yeah, I don't know about you guys, but I find this messaging really complex. So mom, we're going to offer you something that may detect a change in the DNA that could be an early warning for disease, but we won't pick up everything your baby could have that's genetic. And even if we did, we wouldn't pick up everything your baby could have that could land them in the NICU or cancer ward or anything else. And we're not 100% sure, based on penetrance and expressivity, that what we pick up will be actually meaningful for your baby over the next 5 years. You could really easily say a mom going, then why would I do this? But nevertheless, you want to finish this up, Mark?
Yeah, I like what you said, Lily, about having the end game in mind. Who are we talking about here? It's not just the parents of the individuals that will screen positive. It's also the families of the individuals who are going to screen negative. And what are we doing when we communicate this? So education was top of mind for me, but to have a corollary there, it's also communication. Who's going to do the communication? What is that communication, and when is it going to be presented? And I feel like the more you can get ahead of those conversations and set the right expectations, the better, because I've often thought about this when we were talking some years ago about direct-to-consumer genetics. The lay population struggles with statistics. Everybody struggles with statistics, but especially the lay population. They struggle with genetics as well. These are very complicated, deep fields, and then you layer into that your own health and disease status, and that's a perfect storm of challenge. So that's why I know why you were nodding so vigorously. And unfortunately, that's not my bailiwick. I'm just here as a data broker, the evidence provider, but I know it's a real challenge.
All right. Well, let's wind up today's panel by giving a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you very much.